Welcome to Food, Wine, and Whiskey, a podcast about having fun conversations on tasty dishes, vinos, and spirits from around the world. Rob is your host. He is an avid home chef, WSET Level 2 award in wine, and a whiskey drinker and collector. Time to set the table. Here's Rob.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. We appreciate you coming back for another episode. And let me say, if it's your first time here, thank you for stopping in. We hope you enjoy the content we're going to have today. It's going to be a really fun show. If you're back for another episode, thank you so much for coming back. You know, we do this for our listeners. We appreciate our listeners very, very much and can't say thank you enough. If you haven't subscribed, please do that. And you know what really helps us is if you can go out and leave us a review on Google, on Spotify, on any of the listening apps that you're listening to the show on. A review helps us greatly. So if you could do that, really big help to the show. Today's episode, Bob Paulinski, Master of Wine, back on the show. How you doing, Bob?
Rob, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, good to have you. We don't have a, kind of focused topic for today. We're just going to kind of pick at the wine wisdom of Bob Paulinski today.
Oh, man. All right. The pressure's on.
I mean, 40 years in the industry, there's some wisdom there we're going to pick at.
Oh, Rob, it's 40 plus.
40 plus. Setting the bar even higher.
I suppose so. Okay. Let her rip.
Well, let's do this. Before we get started, we've had you on another episode where we talked about, the Master of Wine, what that is, kind of what that journey is to get to that point. Kind of, I don't want to give away too much. If you haven't listened to that episode, go back and listen to it. It's a great, great conversation you and I had. We mentioned in there that not only are you a master of wine, but you do something else in the wine world related to YouTube. What do you got going on there?
Yeah, so Rob, in late 2022, I launched a wine YouTube channel. It's simply Bob Paulinski, Master of Wine. I put out long format videos virtually every week, sprinkle in some short format. I post a wine question every day in the community tab. Some of the questions are relatively straightforward and simple. Some are a bit more challenging. I try to mix it up. But the channel's been around since late 2022. I'm thrilled at the early response has been great. And, with YouTube, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. But right now I've got a little over 3,000 subscribers. Engagement's very good. I've got a community of people where very interactive. So there's a lot of comments and questions, and a lot of the videos are based on what people are looking for. So I take the feedback from my subscribers. Generally speaking, the videos have to do with a particular region. I may do a deep dive into a region or a grape variety. Sometimes I'm opening old bottles from my personal cellar. It could be tips on shopping for wine, and I travel a good amount as well. So some of the videos are actually out in the road. I'm on the vineyard, in a cellar, so on. So I really try to mix it up.
Yeah, the thing I really like about your channel is you're really helping, the average wine drinker or the new wine drinker kind of navigate the world of wine. How to explore, what should you be looking for, what to expect out of a certain grape, what to expect out of a certain grape out of different regions. Things like that. And it's really, really helpful for people who are getting into wine.
Oh, well, thanks for that, Rob. My feeling is the core audience are really two groups that are quite similar. It's either individuals that are in some sort of wine education program, like the WSET, for instance, or it's just wine drinkers who want to learn more about what's in their glass and a little bit more about the story. I think there's content there that would be fitting for people that are just getting into wine, but it ramps up a bit beyond that. I'm getting into some of the details that are a little more fine. And I really try to do my best to present it in a way where It'll connect with a broad audience. And for me, the thing that is the massive turnoff with wine is the pretentious element. It needs to be accessible. People need to be comfortable and happy with the experience. So, I try to make it all inclusive.
And I think you do a great job of that. And when I say, that kind of that new wine drinker, you brought up a good point. Even if you have some experience in wine, and by experience, it could be you've been drinking wine for a while, but maybe, what I say in wine, Bob, is it's always about the continued exploring. And I think that's where you help so much with your channel is, those of us who want to explore the world of wine. It's a rabbit hole you can't get down. You're never going to reach the bottom. So your channel does a great job of continuing the exploration of wine. That's really what I enjoy. Not the only thing I enjoy about it, but it's one of the big factors that I enjoy about your channel.
Oh, Rob, no, I appreciate hearing that. I mean, look, for me, I've been in this business for more than 40 years, and I'm continually learning as well. There's so much happening out in the wine world in terms of new regions coming on board, new winemaking techniques. I mean, it never ends, and then it gets reshuffled each year with a new vintage.
Yeah.
So you never can learn it all. And for me, it's actually the appealing piece to it. There's always something new to explore.
Yeah, one of the other things I want to mention about your channel is the community that you mentioned. I think a lot of people might think you go to YouTube and it's just watch a video and move on. There really is a community that you build within your channels, and you do a really good job of engaging that community. And I think they engage with you, and I think that's really a cool thing. The other part of that I want to say is that community is not just in the U.S. You're based in the U.S., but I find it interesting how broad around the globe your community is.
Yeah, you're spot on, Rob. So I'm on the West Coast. I'm in the Bay Area, and as this channel develops and grows, much of the growth is coming from overseas. Many countries in Europe, Scandinavian countries, the UK, Canada, Southeast Asia, South Korea, Japan, Australia. I mean, the reach is amazing. And, I think sometimes we take this for granted in today's world. There's instant access to anyone everywhere. And, but to me, it really is gratifying when I have someone reach out to me who's in Southeast Asia, and later in the day, I'm speaking to someone in Norway.
Yeah.
The fact that they would put the effort into commenting, asking a question, whatever that communication may be, I do my very best to follow up on each and every comment. And oftentimes, the comment ends up being a dialogue going back and forth as well. So there's a lot of exchange of communication.
Are you ready then to jump into some wine wisdom with Bob?
Let her rip.
All right.
Let her rip. I'm ready. I'm ready.
The first topic I'm going to throw out for us to discuss is, when you get into wine or you've been into wine for a while, one of the things you want to do is you want to look for value, right? You want wines that punch up. You're always trying to find that wine that, maybe you paid $20 for it, but you would have been happy to pay 30 or 40 because it's so good. So if we ask you some undervalued wines around the world, maybe it's a specific wine that you think deserves some recognition, maybe it's a region, what would be some undervalued wines for you around the globe?
Well, Rob, with that question, I think in today's market, there are more values than there's ever been. And at a macro level, for many years, and this is still true in today's world, there is more wine produced than there is people to drink it. So there's always an overabundance, but that overabundance oftentimes is not in the most high-profile regions. So one of the pointers that I would suggest is you need to start looking where people are generally not looking. And like any consumer product, there's a supply and demand element that plays out. But there are a tremendous amount of values out there, and as I think this through a little bit, well, what is it that drives that value statement? Well, I think for one, there's the consideration of how much does it cost to actually produce your wine. You think of, I'm on the West Coast near Napa Valley. Land cost, extremely high. Labor cost, very, very high. You think of other places in the world, in Chile, for instance, land costs much less, the labor is much cheaper. In places like Australia, you tend to find much more mechanization used. So there's economies that come into play in certain places. So I think in one aspect, I would always look in those areas that are not the most high profile. So, for instance, in Burgundy, you think of Burgundy, the eastern part of France, very high profile, tremendous demand for those wines. You're not going to find value in those top estates that are Grand Cru or Premier Cru. But sometimes, if you look in the areas that are the periphery, you can find unbelievable values because they're in lower cost regions. They're not the prestige regions. A classic example of that in today's world is Bordeaux. I think if you're into wine to any degree, you've got some image of Bordeaux. And for a lot of people, that image is the very iconic, great classified gross of in the left bank with Pauillac and Margaux and so on, and the premium on the right bank with Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. But there are so-called satellite districts all around those iconic regions. The values are amazing. And with Bordeaux in recent years, and I'm using Bordeaux for an example because no matter where you're at around the world, you're probably going to have some access to Bordeaux. But the fact is, in recent years, it's really tough to go in terms of choosing a vintage. You have to go back to maybe 2013 or so before you get a vintage that's really suspect. So if you're out shopping and you're finding these periphery regions of Bordeaux, and it could be places like Fronsac, for instance, is just I think a sensational region that gets good distribution around the world. You can find these at a fraction of the cost of these great classifies. I'm not saying they're going to rival that in quality, but quality for the money, value for the money, there's some of the best wines that you can find anywhere. And it's from an iconic region, but it's that periphery, and it's the same when you're in Napa. If you went up to Mendocino, for instance, you can find incredible wines from Mendocino at a fraction of the price. Are they going to be Napa? No, but there is some similar characteristic.
So I want to ask this along those lines. When you talk about Bordeaux and you mentioned Burgundy, a lot of folks might think you've already dispelled the cost factor, that you can find value there. But a lot of people think, well, if it's a Bordeaux or a Burgundy, that means I've got to sit on it. Not necessarily the case, correct?
No, not at all. And look, when you say sit on it or cellar it, that's all a personal preference, whether you like aged wines or not. And I would argue for most people, probably not. They're looking more for wines that have that primary fruit and all those youthful characteristics. But with Burgundy, which can be ultra confusing in terms of the complexity of sorting out that whole region. But essentially, there are two areas that are prime real estate. And that is the Côte de Nuits, and just south to that is the Côte de Beaune. Most anything within those two areas, you're going to pay premium dollar. If you go further south, an area called Côte Chalonnaise, there you'll find fantastic values in both reds and whites from places like Bouzeron and Givry and Mercury, Montigny, for instance. Great values, and the wines will be, they're not equivalent to what you'll find in Côte de Beaune or Côte de Nuit, but the wines will have a lot of character, a sense of place, and they'll be supreme quality for the money.
Okay, let's ask this. In the world of wine, a lot of folks, associate quality wines with the wines they know, the grapes they know, which are, the Bordeaux grapes, the Cabernets and the Merlots or the Syrahs, Pinot Noirs, things like that. Are there some specific regions for those grapes that you like, that you think you can get really good value? And then the part two to that is, what about indigenous grapes? How do you value those?
Yeah. So to the first question, with some of the better known international grape varieties, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Cabernet, that sort of thing. Again, I think it's a matter of looking in those areas where the production costs are lower. You can find examples in Chile, Argentina, Australia is doing some very interesting things that are very value conscious. In the south of France, down in the Languedoc area, these are regions that generally produce more volume, and the value for the well-known grape varieties can be extremely good. The point that you raise about the indigenous grape varieties, I think this is the next big thing in the wine world. And you're finding these examples in many places in Europe, certainly in Italy, Spain, Portugal, some degree in France, Germany. They have this plethora of indigenous grape varieties that in some cases, if you went back 40, 50, 60 years ago, some of these grape varieties were almost gone. Okay, they almost ceased to exist. And the reason for that was, back decades ago, there was much more of a focus on producing high volume versus premium quality. Well, preferences have changed. People are generally drinking less, but drinking much better. So these grape varieties that really lost their place in the world have now all of a sudden become very relevant again. And I think the aspect that's most appealing about them is many of these will tie back to a specific region, and only a region, like Pecorino, for instance, in Abruzzo. Incredible wines, fantastic values. And you'll find it basically in Abruzzo and a little bit north in Marche. Around the world, virtually none. But there's examples like this, and to me, they're some of the most interesting wines in the world now because they have a sense of place, they're unique, and in many cases, they have a history that was almost lost, and now it's become relevant again.
You mentioned Pecorino. Are there a couple of other regions and wines, varieties within that region that you'd like to throw out? Listeners might be listening going, okay, what are some regions and some indigenous grapes or wines that I need to go out and search out?
So a couple of other options in Italy, if you went further south to Puglia, which is, many people would describe that as the heel of the boot, the more of the southern portion of Italy, southeast portion. There you'll find Fiano, another grape variety that was almost lost decades ago. It's a white that generally is crisp, fresh, bright. It has good acidity, good body to it, lots of character. Another one from that area would be Negro Moro, which is a grape variety that produces denser, fuller style reds, but again, very much tied to that part of the world. In Sicily, a couple of grape varieties there that I think are just fantastic. There's a white called Grillo, and spelled Grillo. Wonderful white wines, good character, body, good acidity, generally no oak style, so they're that vibrant, fresh style. And the other, which is very common there, is Nero d'Avola. Again, another excellent, and when I'm saying value, you can find sound wines made from Grillo or Nero d'Avola easily for under $15 that are solid, well-made wines. Portugal is a rock star when it comes to this space. You have around 250 indigenous grape varieties from that country. For the most part, they are doing virtually nothing with these international grape varieties. They've really focused on these indigenous. So there you'll find things like Touriga Nacional, which is the predominant red grape variety there. You're hard pressed to go wrong with Touriga Nacional. I mean, I think the wine's deep, dense, full, a lot of character. Things that are a little tougher to find, but very interesting. A grape variety like Baga, for instance. And you'll have to, in many cases, go to a specialty retailer or find some of these online. But increasingly, you can find good wines from Douro, for instance, which is the prime growing area in Portugal. Oftentimes you can find these in a neighborhood store. They're starting to get their way out there.
Something I think about is, when we say old world, most people, rightfully so, go Spain, Italy, France. But there's some other old world regions that have been making wine for a very long time that I think are starting to pop up a little more on the radar. Greece and Croatia and places like this. Georgia. Yeah. So like in many cases, it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag. Finding a source for some of the wines that are in more the eastern portion of Europe can be a bit more challenging depending on where you're at in the world. Oftentimes the labels are going to be a bit more confusing. So there may be a little bit of a need to sort through some of that. But if you're really looking into exploring and trying things that are different, there are plenty of gems from these places. It's a matter of the due diligence to sort through it. Many of the whites that we're talking about, many of the white wines, vintage is going to be very important. Some of these are not wines meant to be aged, so you want to make sure you're getting something that's fresh and bright. And if it's built on that primary fruit character, you're probably looking at wines that are no more than about 3 years from the vintage. We mentioned a couple of times in our conversation, just right there, aging wine, me mentioning earlier, sitting on, the thought that you have to sit on a wine from Bordeaux or cellar it. Let's shift topics and talk about wine. You kind of mentioned this and answered this. Is wine worth aging? That's the question a lot of people ask. And a lot of people go, is the wine actually getting better or is it just changing in the bottle?
Yeah, so there's a big degree of subjectivity here. There's this old notion that's been floating out there forever. Somehow older wine is better wine. Well, that's absolutely, in my opinion, that's not true for probably 99% of the wine produced in the world. The vast majority of wine is meant to be consumed within 2 to 3, 4 years of the vintage. And the reason for that is many wines are built with this primary fruit. And what I mean by that is these are wines that are very bright, fresh. They've got this exuberance, and they're all built on this bright fruit character. That fruit character will fade after a few years. And Rob, it's like if you had an apple and you cut it in half and set it on the counter all night. The next morning, it might be a little brown and it might taste okay, but it's not as good as it can be. And in some ways, this is what happens to a good number of wines. Now, the small fraction, that 1-2%, that actually can age well, by that, what we're implying is the wine improves from its starting point to some time down the road. And for a wine to actually improve, first off, you can't have a crap bottle of wine and keep it for a number of years and it's going to turn into something wonderful. Okay, that's not how it works. When the wine is first released, if it's something that is well made, and by that what I mean is the wine is balanced, it has extract, it has adequate alcohol. Let's say if it's a red, the tannin, it has some tannin level to give the wine some longevity. It's from a solid vintage. I mean, there's so many factors to take into consideration in terms of aging a wine. And, I think some of the standard method would be you look at areas that have a precedent. Go back to Bordeaux, for instance. Some of the greatest aged wines that I've ever had have been Bordeaux's. But it's from the right producer in the right vintage. And the piece that is critically important is that you're acquiring the wine at some point and supposedly aging it. Well, it's storing that wine in conditions that are advantageous to the wine to develop its best potential. I can't overstress how important it is to store your wines properly. And it's not all that difficult, really. I mean, it's a matter of having a temperature that is fairly consistent, not too warm. You minimize UV light. I mean, it's not all that difficult, but there is some care that's definitely required.
I want to ask about, we're talking about the wine changing, worth aging a wine, and we kind of hit on that right there. So what about, just a wine lasting? There's a difference, right? There's wines that you mentioned that are made to be consumed in 3 to 4 years. There's other wines that are quality wines, having the structure that you talked about, that may not necessarily change, but will last in the cellar. So that if you want to buy a vintage that's supposed to be really good, but you want to save that bottle for a special occasion, an anniversary, a milestone 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 10 years from now, it would still be good. So there's a difference between changing in the bottle, but lasting in the cellar.
Yeah, there's a good number of wines that can maintain themselves, but I would argue they're really not going to evolve and develop into something that is exceptional. That's true. So yeah, there is certainly that consideration. But I would also look at it like this, Rob. If you're keeping a wine because it's a benchmark anniversary, and the date means something important, doing a little due diligence in terms of, is this a wine that has the potential to age, and then storing it well is going to be everything in terms of, here comes the day where you open that wine and, hey, it's great. We love it. Everything about this is wonderful. Or it's the big, wah, wah, wah,
Yeah.
It's that due diligence piece that's extremely important.
I learned that from another wine person that I had on an episode, and it really made me think about that. Going, wine may not necessarily change; it may last, but it's not going to necessarily change. And the only reason I bring that up is because we talk about vintage specific, right? There might be wines that are released that if I want that wine for a later date, I need to buy it now because it's going to be out of the market in a year, and so I need to be able to hold on to it for a little while.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things to consider too is, as a wine ages, oftentimes what will happen is it'll start to transition from having that primary fruit to something called tertiary characteristics. So a lot of that bright fruit character, that exuberance, that freshness will start to be tapped down and diminished, and you'll start to get these components that are tertiary. And some of this will include some oxidative character can happen. Wine can start to throw some sediment, as there's a lot of complexity in terms of what's in a wine, and gradually, in some cases, you'll have molecules that become long chain. They start to fall out of the solution. And there's a lot of things that happen as the wine ages. So if you try a wine today and it's something that you really like, think of it a little bit like this is a snapshot in time. You try that wine sometime down the road, and every wine will have a different life cycle. It's shaped a little bit like a bell curve, and it'll hit that peak, and then it'll start to decline. There are some wines where that bell curve is steep and the distance is rather tight and short, and there's others that can be extended over decades. So it's not a one size fits all.
Is there something in the wine that would, you talked about tannin, but is it just knowing the producer? You talk about tannin, alcohol, fruit, all these things that help kind of create this, what I think that life cycle might be. Is it knowing the producer? Is it knowing the wine? Or is there a way to look at a wine and maybe get the spec sheet and be able to tell, can I sit on this for a while, or do I need to consume this in 3 to 4 years?
So I think the best reference, the most reliable reference on that is just look at the precedent. If you're in classic areas, if you're up in Piemonte in northwest Italy and you're looking at Barolo, for instance, or we'll use the Bordeaux example, and there's countless other examples out there of wines that have a proven track record for longevity. If you get outside of that, it's I think the risk factor may be a bit higher. But again, if the wine has, if we're talking reds, for instance, if the wine has structure, it has a good amount of extract, the alcohol level is sound, there's some tannins. I mean, I'm speaking in terms where there's a lot of moving pieces and it's not cookie cutter, but there are certain traits. If you start to tick these off, you go, okay, these are good candidates for cellaring. But for me, it's always looking at those benchmark classic regions that are proven, that I feel, okay, I've got complete confidence in this. I take a crazy flyer sometimes on some wines. I think, okay, I'm interested. How will this age? And, I do my best due diligence up front. And sometimes I think, okay, this turned out really well. Oftentimes I go back and think I should have stayed with the classics. I mean, again, that's just my personal preference.
So the last thing I want to ask on this particular subject is, a lot of folks might be using, we're in this digital world now, the world of technology. And, for me, if for my cellar, I use Cellar Tracker, and it helps me kind of do an inventory of what I have. And it has a lot of cool features that I like to play around with, whether it's creating a restaurant type menu a wine list that you can do when you have a dinner party or something like that. But also in there, it'll give you a drink window for these wines. And I want to make sure that we let the listeners know, I think this is my opinion. I think you would agree with me, Bob. Tell me if you don't. A drink window is a recommendation. If you have a drink window of 2022 to 2026 and it's 2027, that doesn't mean that wine's bad. It could still be perfectly fine. You need to go ahead and drink that wine, try that wine. There's no wine that you're ever going to consume that would do harm to you. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, that's not going to be any harm. You may not enjoy it. The wine may be falling apart and it'll show volatile acidity and it's not going to be pleasant to drink. But look, Rob, oftentimes on my YouTube channel, I may open a 50-year-old bottle of Rioja. If you looked at that cellar tracker, I mean, this is a wine that is way outside of that range. But if the wine has been stored well, sometimes it can be, quite remarkable. Keep in mind too, when you have older wines, and I'll use this example of this 50-year-old Rioja. There are some checks that you can actually play out prior to opening the wine that'll give you some indication whether the wine is still holding up. And for one, oftentimes as a wine ages, the fill level will actually slightly decrease in the bottle. And if you're thinking of Bordeaux bottle, kind of that real, the shouldered bottle, if the wine level is still well within the neck, that's a good indication. Okay, that's an indication the cork is probably still sound and the wine has been stored okay. You can also take a bright light, like a pen light, stand that bottle upright, shine that pen light up into the base of the bottle, what's called the punt, that indentation on the bottom of the bottle. That pen light will actually, even if the glass is green or brown, you can get a good indication of the level of sediment, and you can get some indication of the color. If the color looks very brown, chances are you've got something that is probably in decline. It's heavily oxidized. But again, depending on the style of wine, it still might be interesting to drink. So, again, this is not cookie cutter. There's considerations that will vary depending on which specific wine you're looking at. But that fill level in an aged wine means everything. And then, of course, when it comes to serving that wine, if there is a fair amount of sediment, you may choose to decant it, because that sediment in aged red wine will have a bitterness. It's not all that pleasant. But that wine actually, when it comes into contact with air, it's going to start to change. And if a wine is over the hill, it actually may start to degrade quite quickly when it comes into contact with air. I've had some 20, 25-year-old Barolos that I've opened for some videos that actually have tasted better the next day.
So I lied and said I was done with questions on this topic, but as we talk, you made me think of another one. When we have a younger wine and an older wine, and you talk about the air and how that wine is going to change, I think there's this thought in the wine community that if you're opening an older wine, pour that bad boy in a decanter. Get that thing into a decanter as quick as possible. And a younger wine, just pour it and drink it. You don't have to think much about it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Wow. I think you could make an argument it could be the polar opposite.
I agree.
Okay, so with older wines, and again, it depends on the wine, but if I take that pen light trick and I'm not seeing sediment, I generally will not decant the wine. Okay, I want it to aerate in the glass. Okay, and especially if it's going to be drank over a long period of time, that'll help to extend that window where the wine is really showing well. Older wines, especially wines that are maybe past their peak, that aeration blast that it'll get with the decanting, in many cases, that wine will go into decline fairly quick. So I think in many cases, decanting actually does more harm than good. Okay? With your point about younger wines, oftentimes with younger wines, especially these reds that have some tannin, there's some extract, the wines have some substance and backbone to them. Aeration oftentimes will help to bring out more aromatics and just more pleasant quality in the wine. Now, I've seen these aerators out there. There's all these different gadgets that you can pick up. I think a lot of that is a bunch of bull. If you have the right glassware, you give the wine a good swirl. It essentially performs the same function without all the trappings.
And you nailed it for me, is that part of the enjoyment of drinking wine for me is using the glass as the decanter, seeing it change in my glass, drinking that glass of wine over 20, 30 minutes, not trying to, drink it very quickly. I don't need to drink it at its peak. Part of the enjoyment is letting it evolve and seeing how it's changing in my glass.
So, yeah, I agree. So the wine, in many cases, a wine will change with aeration. It'll also change as the temperature moves as well.
Yeah.
If you have a white wine and that white wine is too chilled, oftentimes as the temp comes up, you're going to get much more aromatics. The wine will have much more flavor to it. Especially, I think, in the U.S., when it comes to refrigeration, when it applied to white wines, we go to the extreme. The wines are served too cold.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, I'm ready to move on to a topic that I want to discuss with you, Bob. That is, I mean, it's extremely complex. It's very hard to navigate. Figuring this out can be stressful. I mean, divorces have been, had because of this topic. It's pairing food with wine, Bob. I mean, I don't know that it can be done.
Oh, you're hitting me with a bomb here,
Yeah.
Rob. Okay, you're asking my opinion of food and wine pairing?
Well, can it be done? Is there such a thing? I mean, can you find that perfect? Because that's the objective, right? Is to find the ultimate wine with the food that you're having. It's got to be very specific, vintage, style, grape. All this matters.
I just don't get it. I think we're making this way too complex, and it's like trying to be ultra precise with something that's inherently imprecise.
Yeah.
So I don't really pay a lot of attention to food and wine pairing. I mean, there's certain things that I'd say, okay, this doesn't work for me. If it works for you and you enjoy it, that's really all that matters. But I think the food and wine pairing is ridiculous. And if someone were to say, well, this wine and this food, well, maybe at that snapshot in time, it worked for that individual. There's certainly a big degree of subjectivity there. But the other factor is these are moving targets. I mean, you may have that dish again and it's not prepared exactly the same. Or that wine is from a different vintage or a different producer. I mean, it's like the pieces are constantly moving. So I think it's a bunch of bull. I mean, I don't pay much attention to it at all. And, I just think it's an exercise in futility.
Yeah, I would say I absolutely agree with you. I think, one point I would make is that typically when you're having a wine dinner and you're pairing wines with a meal that you're preparing, don't overthink it. I think too many people overthink it because you're there really, how much you're going to focus on that wine, or are you going to really focus on the conversation and the people that you're enjoying that wine and that meal with?
Yeah, agreed. A lot of it has to do with the company, the surroundings, it's how you're feeling that day. It's like, are you in a good, happy mood, or, you kind of a sourpuss that day? I mean, all these things kind of factor in. I mean, there's general rules that work for me. I mean, oftentimes if I'm having some sort of seafood dish or some sort of poultry dish, and if it's something that has some richness to it, maybe it's something like scallops or lobsters, generally I'm thinking I want a white wine that has a good amount of acidity. I want something that's bright, fresh. The acidity will cut through that richness in the food, leaves the palate refreshed and clean. You can go back and you're tasting and enjoying everything for all that it has. Oftentimes if I'm having some sort of red meat, for instance, and if it's something that has a degree of fat to it, let's say a ribeye steak, for instance, generally I'm thinking, okay, I would like a red that has some level of tannin. Could be Cabernet, could be Syrah, could be umpteen other things. But that tannin, again, will cut through the fat in the food and, again, leaves the palate kind of fresh and bright, and you can go back and enjoy it again. But I don't go too deep on the rules. Again, if you enjoy it and you find some pleasure in it, hey, go for it. It's your personal preference.
I really think it's a personal preference, and it's really hard to screw it up. I think too many people think about it's hard to get it right. I think the other side of that is probably more accurate. It's hard to screw it up. It really is.
Agreed. Yeah, I agree. And as I travel around and I go to a lot of different places in the world where people have a very different mindset of wine and oftentimes food and wine pairing. And sometimes I'm in places and I think, okay, this is a bit of a wacky combination. And more times than not, it may not be what I would say would be ideal, but it's enjoyable. Yeah, this works. So, it's I think it's something we dwell on too much.
Okay, so there is one thing I want to ask you about food and wine pairing. And again, we've just discussed it's really hard to screw it up. There's really no wrong answer, but there might be, you said there are some kind of general guidelines or rules that you kind of apply, but is there something, have you ever had a dish and a wine that you thought, well, this ain't going to work, but I'm going to give her a go. And then to your surprise, you went, holy cow, this was actually pretty good.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'll give you an example of something that I had recently. I ate something that I have not had in years, Rob. I had a BLT. Okay.
Okay.
Fabulous. And I had maybe 10 bottles of wine that were open that day for a work project. And I thought, okay, I'm going to play around with this. And I'm thinking to myself, probably a light style red is going to be what I'm going to like most. It's probably going to be something that's Grenache based, maybe Pinot Noir, maybe Barbera, but something that had some bright freshness to it. The wine that I liked the most, and I thought, how can this be? I had a big, rich style Margaret River Chardonnay.
Wow.
And I thought, God, this is really good because the wine had enough acidity that it could cut through the fatty element. And the other thing is the wine had so much flavor to it. There was so much going on in that glass that it could stand up to something like smoky bacon. And I just thought, this is really kind of a cool, fun thing. I would have never combined those two if I hadn't had 10 bottles of wine open that day. And I thought, okay, didn't expect this. It works. Open your mind. I'm sure there's 1,000 other combinations that would be enjoyable as well.
I think that's a great point, is to keep an open mind with food and wine. But some listeners might be going, okay, I'm going to keep an open mind, but man, can Bob give me a wine that is just versatile, that I don't have to think about? I'm going to remember this episode. I'm going to remember Bob saying X wine is a very versatile wine. If you're doing a dinner, grab one of these, you're going to be good to go.
Okay, I'll give you a red and a white. And these are my go-to. For red, for me, it's something that's Grenache based. Something like, it wouldn't be all that expensive. It's solid Côte d'Aron Village, for instance. What I like about this is the wine has body, there's plenty of flavor, there's decent acidity, there's not much tannin. Okay, so the wine's going to be accessible at an earlier age. In many cases, you can even chill the wine down a little bit if you wanted to. But the wine has so much flavor to it. I'm talking good examples. Of course, there's others that will not be good, but a good solid Côte d'Aron Village, to me, is extremely versatile with a lot of dishes. It could be a rock solid Garnacha, for instance, from Spain. Same grape variety, different name, it would provide the same function. You can find Grenache examples from Australia that would provide the same benefit. I'm saying Côte d'Aron Village because they're quite plentiful, and I've got a lot of experience with them and a good track record. For a white, I think the most underrated are sparkling. And it doesn't necessarily have to be champagne, which is going to be a bigger dollar. It could be something like Crémant de Bourgogne. Or you can find fantastic sparklers from California, from Australia. But I'm talking ones that are made in a drier style, and because of that high acidity and because of the bubbles, they'll cut through the richness or the fat that you'll find in a lot of dishes. And for me, that's really the primary function of matching wine and food, is something that keeps your palate refreshed. And I find that those two are it's tough to go wrong with either one of those.
Yeah, I think those are great recommendations. And the sparkling, I think, might catch a few people by surprise a little bit, because I think there's
Yeah.
if you're not big into wine, you may not realize how well sparkling wine goes with food. It really is a good accompaniment to food.
It, I think it's oftentimes pigeonholed as something that's celebratory. And it's so much more than that. I mean, you can enjoy sparkling all throughout the meal. And the other thing, Rob, is if you're with a group of people, let's say some of them are newbies to wine, generally sparkling is going to be well received by a broad audience.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of regions, but I would even throw out, I love a cava, and I like a Franciacorta from Italy. I think are great examples of sparkling in that traditional method.
Well, absolutely. So the cava, you can find all sorts of fantastic values there. Cavas you can find in the U.S. for under $10, but if you move up into like a Reserva, you can find those in the mid to upper teens, $20-ish range. I agree. They're fantastic, and there's countless other places around the world as well. But Cava is so plentiful. Yeah, that would be a perfect fit.
So that kind of leads us to the next kind of just random questions I've got for you. But when we finish on sparkling wine,
Okay.
it leads me to the question of the wine glass. How important is it? And let's start with the flute, because we just finished talking about sparkling wine. Your thoughts on the flute? Is it the proper vessel for the sparkling wine?
Okay, so just for clarity, for the flute, what we're talking about is really a narrow cylinder. It's like, and it's built in a way where the bubbles have a place where they can rise up. Personally, I can't stand the flute. And the reason for that is up at the top where your nose is, and maybe my nose is too big, but I just find the aromatics from the flute is very much diminished. So I'm not a fan of it. And sometimes I'll hear people counter with, well, but with the flute, it'll give you much longer period of time where you'll get those bubbles. And well, my argument to that is if it's a decent glass of sparkling, that's probably not going to be around all that long anyway. I'm not worried about going flat. Generally, what I use is a white wine glass. I also like the champagne glasses that are a little bit tighter, a little more narrow, but they're not quite to the level of a flute. And it gives you the ability to get your nose there where you can get the aromatics and you can still get a good stream of bubbles. But look, I'm not a fan of the flute, but I get it. It looks good. It looks elegant on the table.
Yeah, I think to your point you made earlier, Bob, a lot of people think about sparkling wine as that celebratory drink, and it's still a wine. It still has, the things about a wine that we like, and having somewhat of a still a bowl that you can, I don't know, some people, there's some controversy on swirling or not swirling, but there's still some aromatics that come up, and that's why you want that narrow top to still enjoy that as part of the experience.
Yeah, so for me, I'll still give it a swirl, but much less than with a still wine. And what I want to do is that just give it like a, once, twice around the glass. I mean, nothing that's too vigorous. It's enough to release more of the aromatics, and without really tapping down the level of bubbles.
So I want to ask you about that sweet spot in wine. I think a lot of people think that, man, I want to get into wine, but it's this classy beverage and it's expensive to get good wine. Is there a sweet spot that you would say, what's the floor and what's that ceiling to get a good wine? Because everybody knows that if I spend, 70, 100 or more dollars on a wine, it better be good. But is there a sweet spot where you go, hey, you can drink really good wine for X to X amount of dollars.
Yeah. So your first comment on wine being something that's it's this like rarefied beverage. Take a look at the generation that's just getting into wine today. A lot of these preconceived notions of wine, these things are being cast aside really quick. So it's accessible and it's plentiful and it's just something meant to enhance your personal experience. The barriers and all these pretentious notions that are attached to wine. I mean, these things are fading. They're not fading fast enough, in my opinion. But in terms of finding wines that have character, and there's something that I talk about often is a sense of place. Wines that have a characteristic that can only come from a specific region. And to me, this is one of the cool things about wine. It's like, okay, you can have Chardonnay from 10 different places, and maybe 9 of them can actually taste very much alike. They're almost made like commodities. But you can find that example that has a true sense of place. Use an example like Chablis, for instance. But in my opinion, oftentimes you can find wines that have this artisanal feel, this sense of place, excellent quality, and you can easily find that, again, in the U.S. in that $20 range without a whole lot of hassle. Again, it depends on the region because, again, as we talked about earlier in this conversation, some places the supply and demand will impact cost. But with a little bit of digging and looking and due diligence, I mean, you could put together a case of wine for a couple of $100s. I'm talking a dozen bottles. And you could have something interesting and something that's not commoditized and homogenized and corporatized, which is what you have in a lot of the wine world now, and finding these wines that are really interesting. It's a little bit like going to some little bistro where you have someone in the kitchen who's doing all the due diligence like all morning long to make you a great meal at night versus walking into some chain restaurant. It's a little bit of the same.
That makes perfect sense. Here's a touchy subject. You ready for this question? Whether you're ready or not, here it comes, Bob.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming. All right.
Sulfites in wine. I have so many friends that I can't drink wine because of sulfites. And I know you're no doctor. I know you're not a scientist, but you have experience and knowledge of really the amount of sulfites in wine compared to other things that we see sulfites in. Can we talk a little bit about sulfites and how they really would be affecting you in wine?
Yeah. So if you feel like sulfites are affecting you, I mean, definitely speak to someone who's an expert, someone in the medical field who can answer that. But I think oftentimes the connection to sulfites and wine, first off, sulfites are not something new in wine. This goes back to, Roman times. So this is nothing that's new. It's also something that's found in a lot of foods as well. So this is not something just linked to wine. Rob, one of the things that I still hear from people is, well, when I was in Europe, I drank wine every day and I never had a problem because there's no sulfites. Well, that's not true. The labeling laws are different. And in the U.S., I think this is going back to the 1980s. You think of salad bars in the U.S. and these restaurants, these food manufacturers trying to extend the life of this produce. It was such an extreme level that there were people that were having reactions to this. And oftentimes with sulfites, it's more of like, it's not so much headaches. It's more like, allergic reactions and sinus issues, that sort of thing. Look, I drink wine virtually every day. I've never really had any problems with sulfites. But there are some wines that will have much higher levels. And those oftentimes tend to be lighter, sweeter white wines. And the reason they have more is because the wines, there are more things that could happen to that wine where the microbial side of it can go off the rails and the wine could actually become destabilized. So over the last 20 years or so, the level of sulfite in wine has greatly decreased. And it's because the science behind wine has very much improved. So the reasons that sulfite was added, in some cases to an extreme some years ago, is now very much the rarity. And the other piece, Rob, is more and more wineries today are moving towards organic and biodynamic and this sort of thing, which also limits the amount of sulfite that can be used in a wine. The bigger issue is histamines.
That would be my thought.
Yeah.
Okay, Bob, been a great hour. Had a lot of fun with this conversation. We're going to wrap it up, but I want to wrap it up with this. Those who are watching and can see it on the video, as you make your arm gestures and your hand gestures, I'm seeing some ink on the arm that looks to be wine related. What's going on there?
Yeah, man, I got them all tatted up. Yeah, I'm getting another one soon, but this is a half sleeve. I got this last year while I was traveling in Malaysia. And for anyone who can actually see the video, Grenache, Syrah.
I know what's coming.
What's coming?
Mourvedre?
Maybe. I don't know. But yeah, there's another one coming on this arm before too long.
Well, very cool.
I can't believe you asked that question. Really?
Look, anybody who's seeing the video is going to notice that. And so, hey, that piqued my interest. So I know anybody else is watching is going, are those grapes on his arm? And sure enough, they are.
Yeah, I found a person in Malaysia. I travel to Malaysia often. And I found a person there. I love the work they did. And this guy has never done wine grapes before, but he's done work that's similar. I loved it. We had some communication back and forth. I went to his place, and 8 hours later, I walk out. I'm a happy man.
Is there a reason we went with those varieties?
Yeah. I think the greatest, most interesting wines I've had have been Syrah and Grenache. Two grape varieties that I've had incredible experience with in the Rhone, certainly Garnacha in Spain. I used to live in Australia, Shiraz, Grenache, big players there. It just seems to kind of follow me, and it felt right. And so I thought, what the hell, I'm going for it.
Well, I think they look cool.
Well, I appreciate it.
Let's finish up. Tell everybody one more time where they can find you on YouTube, the name of the channel, and any social media you want to throw out where they can follow you and find you as well.
Yeah, so it's YouTube, Bob Paulinski, Master of Wine. If you go to the channel in the community tab, again, I'll have questions that are there every day. I post videos on a regular basis. If you go to the About page, it'll give all my social media information as well. Soon I'm going to be doing a live stream, so I'm going to change things up a little bit with some of my videos. I'm going to experiment with doing some blind tasting on some live stream. So I'm just going to put myself out there and we'll see what happens. But yeah, please do check it out. Be greatly appreciated. The support's been wonderful, and if this catches your interest, I'd love to have you be part of the community.
Absolutely. Bob, thanks for coming on again. Everybody, thanks for listening to this episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey. And until our next episode, enjoy the next pour.
Great, everyone. Cheers.